It all started with an envelope. Not a subpoena, not a jury summons, not even one of those passive-aggressive wedding invitations where the dress code is listed as garden cocktail chic. No, this was something far more sinister. This was a notice from the Maple Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Let me back up. My name is Leo, and 6 months ago I did the one thing every millennial is told is impossible. I bought a house. A real, honest-to-God house with a mortgage that could choke a blue whale and a lawn I was now legally obligated to keep alive. After a decade of living in apartments where my downstairs neighbor could hear me blink, having my own patch of suburban turf felt like winning the lottery. Maple Creek Estates was, on the surface, perfect. The lawns were a uniform, chemically enhanced green. The mailboxes stood in a line as straight as a military procession. At precisely 7 o'clock a.m. every Tuesday, a fleet of identical garbage trucks would glide down the street with a quiet, synchronized hum. It was less of a neighborhood and more of a social experiment in enforced serenity. I, being a freelance graphic designer, worked from home. This gave me a front-row seat to the daily ballet of suburban life, conducted by the HOA's self-appointed queen, Carol. Carol was a woman in her late 50s who piloted a golf cart she'd unironically dubbed the Justice Mobile. She'd cruise the pristine asphalt, visor pulled low, clipboard at the ready, her eyes scanning for infractions with the intensity of a predator drone. A slightly too tall sunflower? Violation? A festive wreath left up a day past New Year's? Fine. Her presence was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that buzzed beneath the neighborhood's placid surface. My personal slice of heaven included a lovely front porch. On it, I had arranged a collection of about 20 stylish terracotta and ceramic flower pots. They were in various sizes, creating a nice, rustic, tiered effect. They were also all completely, utterly empty. My grand plan had been to fill them with a lush assortment of herbs and flowers. I'd imagined myself plucking fresh basil for a caprese salad, a modern-day Cincinnatus tending his humble garden. But then a big client project came in. A new season of Space Vikings dropped. And, well, life happened. The pots remained empty, symbols of my good intentions. I thought they looked architectural, sculptural even. Carol, it turned out, disagreed with my artistic assessment. That morning, I was enjoying my second cup of coffee, watching a squirrel try to solve the physics-defying puzzle of my squirrel-proof bird feeder when I saw the Justice Mobile glide to a halt in front of my house. Carol didn't get out. She just sat there for a long moment, her head tilted. I could feel her judgment radiating across my perfectly manicured lawn. She made a small, decisive check mark on her clipboard, then drove off. I didn't think much of it. Maybe she was just admiring my symmetrical pot arrangement. An hour later, I went to grab the mail. Taped to my front door, for maximum visual impact, was a crisp brown envelope with the Maple Creek Estates logo embossed in gaudy gold. It felt less like a letter and more like a summons. I peeled it off, the tape taking a tiny fleck of my new paint with it. Violation number 1, I thought, and went inside. I poured another coffee, sat at my kitchen island, and opened it. The paper was thick, expensive. The kind of paper used for things that are meant to feel important and intimidating. I began to read it aloud to my cat, Gizmo, who was busy trying to lick a spot of dried yogurt off the floor. Dear resident of 112 Orchard Lane, I began, my voice dripping with mock solemnity. This letter serves as a formal notice of a violation of the Maple Creek Estate's covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Gizmo paused his licking, looking up as if he understood the gravity of the situation. As per Bylaw 7, Section 4, Paragraph B, I continued, all exterior decorative containers, including but not limited to planters, pots, and urns, must be actively cultivated with living botanical matter or otherwise stored in a location not visible from the street or common areas. I stopped. Actively cultivated? I asked the cat. What does that even mean? Do I need to be out there giving them pep talks? I kept reading. An inspection conducted on October 12, 2025, by an authorized agent of the association revealed a collection of approximately 20 non-cultivated ceramic and terracotta vessels situated on the front porch of the aforementioned property. Non-cultivated ceramic vessels. They weren't just pots anymore. They had been elevated to the status of a legal infraction. I felt like I should be calling a lawyer, a pot lawyer, a potterny, if you will. You are hereby instructed to rectify this violation within 14 calendar days from the date of this notice. Failure to comply will result in a fine of $2,500 per day until the property is brought into full compliance. We appreciate your cooperation in maintaining the aesthetic harmony of our community. It was signed in a sharp, aggressive script. Carol Jenkins, President, Maple Creek Estates, HOA. I stared at the letter, a slow burn starting in my chest. It was the sheer, unadulterated absurdity of it all. The bureaucratic jargon, the passive-aggressive tone, the idea that my empty pots were somehow disrupting the aesthetic harmony of a neighborhood filled with houses that were all beige-colored clones of each other. My first instinct was to just sigh, haul the pots into the garage, and be done with it. It was the path of least resistance. But then, I glanced out the window. Just as I did, the Justice Mobile cruised by again. Carol was at the wheel, and as she passed my house, she looked right at me, a tiny, triumphant smirk playing on her lips before she gave a slow, deliberate little wave. And that was it. That was the moment the switch flipped. This was no longer about empty pots. This was a declaration of war. A war of pettiness, a war of wills. She wanted my pots to be actively cultivated, did she? Fine. I'd give her actively cultivated. I'd give her the most active plants the world had ever seen. I spun around in my chair, opened my laptop, and typed "most aggressive houseplants" into the search bar. Cacti were too passive. Poison ivy was probably illegal. And then I saw it. The perfect solution. A plant that didn't just sit there and look pretty. A plant that participated, a plant with an attitude, Dionea muscipula, the Venus flytrap. A slow, wicked grin spread across my face. "Oh, Carol," I whispered to the empty room, "you have no idea what you've just started." My mission began the next day. I bypassed the sterile, soulless aisles of the big-box home improvement stores. A war of this magnitude required specialized weaponry, not the generic flora they sold next to the discount tiki torches. My quest for malicious compliance led me to a place on the outskirts of town I'd only ever heard whispers about, a nursery called the Prickly Pear. The sign was hand-carved, and the greenhouse behind it looked less like a commercial establishment and more like a science experiment that had been left to run wild for a few decades. It was perfect. The air inside was thick, humid, and smelled of damp earth and something vaguely spicy. The place was a chaotic jungle of strange, otherworldly plants. Cacti twisted into unnatural shapes. Succulents hung from the ceiling in dense, dripping curtains, and in the back, under a special set of grow lights, was the carnivorous section. Behind a counter made from a massive slab of petrified wood stood a man who looked like he'd been grown there himself. He was tall and reedy, with a long gray beard braided with little wooden beads, and he wore a t-shirt that said, "I like my soil like I like my coffee, black and full of worms." "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I hope so," I said, stepping forward. "I need plants, aggressive ones, plants with an attitude, plants that send a message." He stopped wiping the counter and gave me a long, searching look. A slow smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "HOA trouble," he stated. It wasn't a question. "You have no idea," I sighed. "I've been cited for owning non-cultivated ceramic vessels." He let out a dry, rasping laugh. "A classic. Bylaw 7, I'm guessing? The aesthetic harmony clause?" "You're a prophet," I said, amazed. "Silas," he introduced himself, wiping his hand on his jeans before offering it. "And I'm not a prophet, son. I'm a veteran. I've been arming the suburban rebels for 20 years. You've come to the right place. You don't want a plant. You want a statement." Silas became my guru, my botanical quartermaster. He led me to the carnivorous section, his eyes gleaming with conspiratorial delight. "The Venus flytrap," he said with the reverence of a sommelier describing a rare vintage. "Nature's perfect little monster, a beautiful, elegant up yours to petty tyrants everywhere." He showed me his prize specimens. They weren't the sad, wilted things you see in plastic domes at the grocery store. These were vibrant, healthy, and terrifying. Their little mouths, fringed with what looked like menacing green eyelashes, were gaping open, waiting for a meal. "I'll need about 20, I said. Silas's eyebrows shot up. 20? Son, you're not just sending a message. You're staging a coup." He spent the next hour giving me a master class in flytrap care, his instructions becoming more and more dramatic as he went on. "Forget everything you know about plants," he said, waving a finger at me. "They hate nutrients. The soil must be poor, a mix of peat moss and sand. It reminds them of the hard-knock life in the bogs of the Carolinas." He handed me a jug of water. "And this, distilled water only. Rainwater, if you can collect it. Tap water is poison to these killers. The minerals will build up in their systems, and they'll get sluggish before they die a slow, agonizing death." He made it sound like I was adopting a family of tiny green sharks. I left the prickly pear with 2 trays of Venus flytraps, several bags of special soil, and a jug of distilled water, feeling like a revolutionary smuggling pamphlets out of a clandestine printing press. Planting day was that Saturday. I didn't just fill the pots. I curated an experience. I set up all 20 pots on my porch, a terracotta army awaiting its soldiers. I carefully mixed the peat and sand, filled each pot, and gently nestled each flytrap into its new home. I misted them with the distilled water from a special spray bottle, whispering words of encouragement. "You're going to do great things here," I told a particularly robust-looking one. "You're going to be a star." I decided to name that one Carol Jr. As I was finishing up, my next-door neighbor, Hank, wandered over. Hank was a retired mailman in his late 60s with a big, friendly belly and a laugh that could startle birds out of trees. He was, in a word, chill. The antithesis of everything Carol stood for. "What you got there, Leo?" he asked, peering at one of the pots. Some of them fancy lettuces? Look a little bitey. Venus flytraps, Hank, I said, grinning. 20 of them. The HOA sent me a letter, said my empty pots needed to be actively cultivated. Hank stared at me for a beat, his brain processing the information. Then his face broke into a wide grin, and he let out a thunderous belly laugh that echoed down the quiet street. He slapped his knee, tears welling in his eyes. "Oh, that's rich," he roared. "Actively cultivated. You're gonna give Carol a full-blown aneurysm with these things. I love it. That's the best darn thing I've heard all year." Hank's validation was the morale boost I needed. I had an ally. The revolution had its first supporter. The moment of truth arrived the following Tuesday. I had arranged my schedule to be free for Carol's typical mid-morning patrol. I was sitting on my porch swing, sipping a tall glass of iced tea, trying to look as casual and non-confrontational as possible. Right on schedule, the Justice Mobile appeared at the end of the street. It moved slowly, methodically, Carol's head swiveling from side to side. As she neared my house, she slowed down, a smug look already forming on her face. She was ready to see those pots gone, ready to chalk up another win for aesthetic harmony. Her golf cart screeched to a halt directly in front of my driveway. The sound was offensively loud in the morning quiet. She got out, clipboard in hand, and began her determined march up my walkway. Her eyes were fixed on the porch, and then they widened. The smugness evaporated, replaced by a look of profound confusion. She stopped dead in her tracks, about 10 feet from the first pot. What are those?" she stammered, pointing a trembling finger. I took a slow sip of my iced tea and gave her my brightest, most innocent smile. "Plants, Carol?" I said cheerfully. "Just like the letter asked. They're being actively cultivated. See?" I pointed to Carol Jr. "This one's name is Bitey. I think he's got your eyes." Carol was speechless. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out. She was completely flustered. She looked at the plants, then down at my porch, then back at the plants. They were plants. They were living. They were, by any reasonable definition, being cultivated. I had followed the letter of the law to the most malicious degree possible. She fumbled with her clipboard, flipping through pages of her sacred bylaws, desperately searching for a loophole, a clause she could use against me. I could see the panic in her eyes. There was nothing about prohibiting carnivorous plants, nothing about a plant's dietary habits. It was a spectacular oversight in her otherwise ironclad suburban constitution. They're unnatural," she finally managed to get out, her voice a weak squeak. "So is charging a man $25 a day for owning pottery, Carol," I said, my smile never wavering. "But here we are." Defeated, she glared at me, her eyes promising a reckoning. She turned without another word, marched back to her golf cart, and drove away at a speed that was almost certainly a violation of the 15 mph neighborhood speed limit. As soon as she was gone, Hank, who had been watching the entire exchange from his own porch, gave me a slow, emphatic thumbs up. I grinned, walked over to Carol Jr. and theatrically pretended to catch a fly out of the air. I held it over the plant's gaping maw and dropped it in. The tiny trap snapped shut with an audible thwip. The first battle had been won. In the quiet, beige battlefield of Maple, Creek Estates, my 20 Venus flytraps were a silent green explosion. They became an instant neighborhood phenomenon. The effect was immediate and polarizing. The neighborhood kids were fascinated. I'd often look out my window to see a small group of them crouched on the sidewalk, pointing and whispering, daring each other to get closer. One brave 7-year-old named Timmy started leaving little offerings of dead ants on the porch railing, a tribute to his new carnivorous gods. I didn't have the heart to tell him they preferred their meals alive and kicking. Hank, my newfound ally, would bring over a beer some evenings, and we'd sit on the porch, watching the plants like it was prime-time television. "Saw a big ol' horsefly get what was comin' to it this morning," he'd say with deep satisfaction. "Made my whole day." The Carroll loyalists, however, were not amused. These were the neighbors whose lawns looked like they were cut with scissors, and whose seasonal decorations went up and came down with stopwatch precision. They'd walk their perfectly coiffed dogs on the other side of the street, casting dirty looks at my porch as if my plants were personally offending their sensibilities. I decided to lean into the absurdity. I bought a small, tasteful wooden sign from an online craft store and staked it in the garden bed next to the porch. It read, "Please don't feed the plants. They can hunt for themselves." The final touch was creating an Instagram account for the main plant, @TheRealCarroll Jr. The bio read, "Just a bog plant living in a suburban world. Carnivore. Activist. Disrupting aesthetic harmony, one fly at a time." I posted dramatic first-person captions from the plant's perspective. "Felt cute. Might digest a spider later." #Plant Life. HOA Wars. It gained a few dozen followers from the neighborhood's younger, more tech-savvy residents. I was becoming a suburban folk hero. Carol, naturally, was apoplectic. She couldn't attack the plants directly. They were, infuriatingly for her, in full compliance. So she did what all cornered despots do. She expanded the war to new fronts. A fresh wave of brown envelopes began to appear taped to my door. She was nitpicking my entire existence, searching for any tiny crack in my regulatory armor. The first notice was for my garbage can. Apparently, I had left it at the curb until 6:15 p.m. on trash day, a full 15 minutes past the 6 p.m. deadline for removal as stipulated in Bylaw 11, Section C. The notice included a time-stamped photo. She had been waiting, watching. The thought was both pathetic and deeply unsettling. The second notice arrived 3 days later. "A blade of grass located on the concrete expansion joint of your driveway was measured by a certified agent of the association at a height of 4.25 inches, it read. "This exceeds the maximum permissible turf height of 4.0 inches, as outlined in the Landscaping Guidelines Addendum." Certified agent? Did she have a grass-measuring specialist on retainer? I imagined a tiny man in a lab coat with a microscopic ruler crawling around my driveway. The third notice was the masterpiece. "Your garden hose, located on the side of the property, was observed to be coiled in a manner inconsistent with community standards. Bylaw 9, Section F requires all hoses to be stored in a perfectly circular, non-kinked fashion. Your hose displayed at least three visible kinks, and its shape was more elliptical than circular. I was being fined for the geometry of my garden hose. I was getting angry, but I was also strangely impressed by her dedication to the craft of being insufferable. She was a master of the form, but I refused to be beaten. If she was going to weaponize the bylaws, then I would simply have to build a better weapon. I sent a polite, formal email to the HOA board requesting a complete, up-to-date digital copy of the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, including all addendums and historical amendments. A few days later, a 300-page PDF landed in my inbox. It was a monstrosity of legalese, a document so dense and boring it could be used as a general anesthetic. That weekend, I brewed a giant pot of coffee, armed myself with a pack of multicolored highlighters, and dove in. My living room looked like a law student's dorm during finals week. I read about fence height restrictions, the approved shades of beige for exterior paint. There were 12, each with a name like Sensible Sand or Quiet Khaki, and a shockingly detailed section on the maximum allowable brightness of holiday light displays, measured in lumens. And as I read, I started to find things. Loopholes, ambiguities, rules that Carol herself was flagrantly violating. My frustration slowly morphed into a giddy sense of empowerment. I was no longer a victim. I was becoming a by-lawyer. The next violation notice was my chance to test my new skills. It was an email from Carol this time, her tone dripping with digital smugness. Subject: Formal notice. Holiday decoration. Violation: 112 Orchard Lane. Dear Mr. Davis, this email serves as a formal notice that your property is in violation of Bylaw 12, Section C. The bylaw clearly states that all holiday-themed lighting and decorations must be removed by January 1st at 11:59 p.m. An inspection on January the 2nd revealed a string of white icicle lights still affixed to your roofline. Please rectify this immediately to avoid further fines. Sincerely, Carol Jenkins, President. I cracked my knuckles and began to type my response. Holiday decoration violation, 112 Orchard Lane. Dear Carol, thank you for your email and your continued diligence in maintaining our community standards. I have reviewed the relevant bylaw and would like to respectfully point out a key distinction. As per my reading of Bylaw 12, Section C, the deadline applies to illuminated holiday displays. As the lights in question were unplugged and therefore not illuminated, they would be more accurately classified as seasonal plastic fixtures, a category for which I can find no specific removal deadline in the current documentation. They are, in essence, simply non-functional roofline adornments. On a related note, while reviewing the bylaws, I was reminded of Bylaw 8, Section A, regarding vehicle usage in common areas. It states that only standard passenger vehicles are permitted to be parked on community streets. Your personal golf cart, which I have often seen parked in front of the community clubhouse, would likely be classified as a non-standard utility vehicle. I'm sure this is just an oversight, but I wanted to bring it to your attention to help you avoid any potential violations yourself. Thank you for your time. All the best, Leo Davis, 112. Orchard Lane. I hit send and leaned back, a feeling of pure, unadulterated triumph washing over me. I received no response. The fines stopped. The icicle lights stayed up until February. Unable to beat me with rules, Carol pivoted to a new strategy, a campaign of disinformation. She started spreading rumors. My beautiful, harmless Venus flytraps were recast as a neighborhood menace. She told people they would attract swarms of insects, which was, technically, the point. She told another neighbor they were poisonous to dogs. Her masterpiece of fear-mongering came when she told Brenda from down the street that the traps were growing so large they could pose a threat to small children. This led to a deeply surreal confrontation one afternoon while I was out misting my plant army. Brenda, a woman whose baseline anxiety level was high alert, scurried across the street, clutching the hand of her 4-year-old son, Braden. "Leo," she said, her voice a nervous whisper. She stopped a good 20 feet from my porch, pulling Braden behind her as if I were harboring a pack of velociraptors. "Hey, Brenda, what's up?" I asked, putting on my friendliest face. "Carol said... She said your plants are a menace," she stammered. "She said they're dangerous. What if..." What if one of them bites my little Braden? She looked genuinely terrified. I looked at Braden, who was currently trying to shove an entire fistful of goldfish crackers into his mouth. Then I looked at Carol Jr., whose largest trap was about the size of a silver dollar. I had to physically restrain myself from laughing. I put on my most serious, reassuring expression. "Brenda," I said, my voice low and calm, "I can promise you, on my honor, that these plants pose absolutely no threat to Braden. Unless your son is the size of a large housefly and has recently learned how to secrete a sugary nectar to lure them in, I think he's going to be okay." I gave her a wink. The real menace in this neighborhood is a 4.25-inch blade of grass, apparently. Brenda blinked, processing my statement. A small smile tugged at her lips. She had been on the receiving end of Carol's nitpicking herself over, the color of her welcome mat. She nodded, squeezed Braden's hand, and walked away looking significantly less terrified. The smear campaign had failed. The war, however, was about to enter a whole new phase. After weeks of trading regulatory blows with Carol, I realized I was letting her dictate the terms of our conflict. My entire homeownership experience was becoming reactive, a series of defensive maneuvers against her attacks. I needed to go on the offensive. Not by being aggressive, but by being proactive. I decided it was time to genuinely improve my property, to do something big and permanent that would force her to engage with me on a whole new level. I was going to build a pergola in my backyard. I loved my backyard. It was a nice, flat rectangle of grass with a concrete patio, but it was barren. It baked in the sun all day, making it unusable for most of the summer. A handsome cedar pergola would provide shade, define the space, and most importantly, require approval from the HOA's Architectural Review Committee, ARC. A committee which, to absolutely no one's surprise, was chaired by Carol Jenkins. This wasn't just a construction project, it was a Trojan horse. Knowing I was walking into the lion's den, I knew I couldn't do it alone. I needed a professional, someone who knew the terrain. After a few calls, I found my man, Dave. Dave was a contractor who came highly recommended, not just for his woodwork, but for his expertise in navigating bureaucratic nightmares. When he showed up at my house, he was exactly what I'd hoped for. He was in his 50s, with a weathered face, hands like catcher's mitts, and a permanent look of cynical amusement in his eyes. He surveyed my backyard, took some measurements, and then turned to me. "Nice place," he grunted. "Maple Creek, huh? You got the Carol problem?" I was floored. "You know her?" Dave let out a short, sharp laugh that was more of a bark. "Son, every contractor in a 20-mile radius knows Carol. She's a legend. Not in a good way. She once tried to write me up because the tire treads on my work truck were aesthetically displeasing to the community curbside. I told her I could get her some fancier ones, but they'd cost extra. She didn't find it funny." I knew instantly he was the man for the job. "I want to build a pergola," I said. "And I want it to be so perfectly, excruciatingly by the book that you can't find a single thing wrong with it." Dave grinned. "I like a challenge. Let's make this thing bulletproof." We spent the next week designing the pergola. Dave was a master. He had a copy of the HOA bylaws on his tablet and cross-referenced every single decision. The height was exactly 6 inches below the maximum allowable height for an auxiliary structure. The support posts were set back from the property line by the precise distance mandated in the covenants. We even chose a wood stain from the pre-approved palette of earth tones. We drew up professional, computer-aided design schematics, included a list of all materials, and wrote a project description that was so full of corporate buzzwords it would have made Carol proud. We submitted the application package to the IRC and waited. The first rejection came a week later. It was an email from Carol on behalf of the committee. Subject: ARC application number 88142. Initial review. The committee has reviewed your application for a backyard pergola. The plan is rejected on the following grounds. The proposed wood stain, listed as natural cedar, is deemed too similar in hue and saturation to the prohibited Sierra redwood. Please resubmit with a selection from the pre-approved brown family of stains. I called Dave. It's a power play, he said, not sounding surprised in the least. She knows it's a valid color, but she's testing you, making you jump through the first hoop. Fine. Change it to sensible bark and send it back. We did. A week later, the second rejection arrived. Subject: ARC application number 88142. Second review. The revised plan is rejected. The submitted schematics, while detailed, do not specify the precise metallic composition and tensile strength of the galvanized screws intended for use in the crossbeam assembly. Please provide a manufacturer's specification sheet for all hardware. You've got to be kidding me, I said to Dave over the phone. She wants to know what my screws are made of? She's stalling, Dave said, a note of grim admiration in his voice. The woman's an artist. All right, go online, find the specs for the screws I use. They're deck screws, for God's sake, and attach the PDF. Send it back. We did. The third rejection was the one that nearly broke me. It arrived 12 days later. Subject: ARC application number 88142. Third review. The application remains rejected. A detailed environmental impact study conducted by the committee has raised concerns. The shadow cast by the proposed pergola structure, specifically at 3:45 p.m. on the third Tuesday of September, may potentially encroach upon the neighboring property's designated full-sun flower bed, home to Mrs. Gable's prize-winning petunias. This constitutes an infringement on a neighbor's right to aesthetic enjoyment. Please submit a revised plan that mitigates this seasonal shadow intrusion. I read the email 3 times, convinced it was a prank. An environmental impact study? Seasonal shadow intrusion? She had to be making this up. I called Dave, ready to throw in the towel. I'm done, Dave, I said, exasperated. This is insane. How are we supposed to fight a shadow? You got a time machine? A shrink ray? Hold on, kid. Don't give up yet, Dave said, his voice thoughtful. She's getting desperate. This is a good sign, but she's also being stupid. She's not giving you a final no. She's just giving you an endless stream of revision requests. How long has it been since we first submitted the plans? I checked the date on our first email. 42 days, I said. I could almost hear Dave's grin through the phone. Read me Bylaw 15, Section G, he said. The part about ARC response times. I scrolled through the massive PDF, my heart starting to pound. I found the section and read it aloud. The Architectural Review Committee shall provide the homeowner with a definitive and final written decision, either an approval with conditions, or a final denial, within 45 calendar days of the initial project submission. Should the committee fail to provide such a definitive and final decision within this time frame, the project shall be deemed automatically approved as submitted. I stopped reading. A slow, beautiful silence hung on the line. Definitive and final decision, Dave repeated slowly, savoring the words. Her mistake was that she never gave you one. She just kept kicking the can down the road with these ridiculous revision requests. She was trying to frustrate you into quitting, but she played herself. She ran out the clock. It was a checkmate so perfect, so elegant, it was almost poetic. She had been so focused on wielding her power through endless bureaucracy that she had become ensnared by her own red tape. That evening, I drafted one last letter. It was polite, professional, and utterly devastating. I printed it, put it in an envelope, and paid the extra few dollars at the post office to send it via certified mail with a return receipt requested. Dear Ms. Jenkins and the Architectural Review Committee, this letter is to serve as formal notification regarding my pending application, RC number 88-1442, for the construction of a backyard pergola, first submitted 46 days ago. As per Bylaw 15, Section G of the Maple Creek Estates Covenants, the RC is required to provide a definitive and final decision within 45 calendar days. To date, I have not received such a decision, but rather a series of requests for minor revisions. As the 45-day window has now expired, the project is deemed automatically approved according to the very rules your committee is tasked with enforcing. Construction is scheduled to begin this coming Monday. We look forward to this valuable addition to our property and the community. Sincerely, Leo Davis, 112 Orchard Lane. I CC'd the entire HOA board and my new best friend, Dave. 2 days later, a text message lit up my phone. It was from him. Checkmate, kid. The lumber arrives Monday. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp, clear autumn sky that makes you feel like anything is possible. At 7:30 a.m. sharp, a flatbed truck rumbled down my street, laden with fragrant stacks of fresh-cut cedar. It was the most beautiful sight I had ever seen. By 8:00 a.m., Dave and his two-man crew were on site, their tool belts jangling with the promise of progress. The air soon filled with the glorious, righteous sounds of circular saws whining and hammers striking nails. It was the symphony of my victory. I was watching from my kitchen window, sipping my coffee with a profound sense of satisfaction, when the inevitable happened. The Justice Mobile came careening around the corner, moving far faster than its electric motor should have allowed. It swerved into my driveway and screeched to a halt just inches from Dave's work truck. Carol vaulted out of the driver's seat, a sheaf of papers clutched in her hand like a weapon. She looked incandescent with rage. Her face was flushed, her pastel polo shirt seemed to be vibrating with indignation, and her visor was askew. She stormed into the backyard, a tiny, furious tornado of suburban tyranny. "Stop this at once!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Stop this construction immediately! This is an unapproved project! You are in violation!" Dave, who was lining up a cut on a long beam, didn't even look up. He finished the cut, the saw screaming in defiance, then switched it off. The sudden silence was deafening. He blew a bit of sawdust off the beam and finally turned his head to look at her, his expression one of profound boredom. "Morning, Carol," he said calmly. "Got an email from the kid here. Says the project's approved. Got a signed certified mail receipt and everything. That's good enough for me. Now, if you'll excuse me," he said, turning back to his saw, "I believe I'm about to violate your morning noise ordinance." He fired up the saw again. Carol was sputtering, completely ignored by the crew, who continued their work as if she were nothing more than a yapping chihuahua. Her authority, the very source of her power in this little kingdom, was being openly and professionally disregarded. She was irrelevant, and she couldn't stand it. Furious and powerless, She did the only thing she could think of. She escalated to the nuclear option. She pulled out her phone, her fingers jabbing at the screen, and made the call I never actually thought she'd make. She called 911. "Yes, I'd like to report illegal construction and a public disturbance at 112 Orchard Lane," she squawked into the phone, loud enough for all of us to hear. "The homeowner is being very hostile." I sighed and walked outside. The commotion was drawing an audience. Hank was on his porch, leaning against a post with his arms crossed, watching with an amused grin. Mrs. Gable, the Petunia lady, was peering through her blinds. A few other neighbors were drifting out of their houses, drawn by the drama. This was no longer a private dispute. It was a public spectacle. 10 minutes later, 2 police cruisers rolled up to my house, their lights off, but their presence alone changing the entire dynamic. 2 officers got out. One was older, with a tired, seen-it-all expression that suggested this was the 10th HOA-related call of his week. The other was younger, looking more curious than anything else. "What's the problem here?" the older officer, whose name tag read Miller, asked in a monotone. Carol rushed toward him like he was a liberating soldier. "Officer, thank goodness you're here!" she cried, her voice filled with manufactured panic. "This man," she said, pointing a trembling finger at me, "is building an illegal structure on his property. I am the president of the Homeowners Association, and this project was explicitly denied. He's trespassing on common property standards." Officer Miller turned his flat gaze to me. "Sir, is this your property?" "Yes, officer," I said calmly. "Do you have a permit for this construction?" "Even better, officer," I replied, holding up a neat manila folder I had prepared for this exact moment. "I have their own bylaws." I handed him the folder. Inside was a copy of my initial application, every rejection letter from Carol, a copy of Bylaw 15 Section G with the 45-day rule highlighted, the certified mail receipt signed by Carol herself, and a printout of my final notification letter. As Officer Miller began to read through the documents, his expression shifted from boredom to a kind of weary resignation. His younger partner, Officer Davis, wandered over to my front porch. "Whoa, are these Venus flytraps?" he asked, crouching down to get a better look. "Cool. My kid loves these things. He watches YouTube videos of them eating bugs for hours." "Help yourself," I said. "They're actively cultivated." Meanwhile, Carol, sensing she was losing the legal argument, pivoted to a more emotional one. "And the noise, officer. The noise has been unbearable. It's causing me severe emotional distress. And his plants are a public menace." Dave, who had been silently observing the scene, decided to chime in. He pulled a tape measure from his belt. "Actually, Carol," he said, his voice deadpan, "my saw operates at about 105 decibels. The city ordinance for daytime construction is 115. So we're well within the legal limit." He paused, looking her up and down. "And ma'am, with all due respect, the only thing causing emotional distress around here is that polo shirt." Officer Davis snorted with laughter, quickly trying to cover it with a cough. Officer Miller finished reading, closed the folder, and let out a long, heavy sigh. He handed it back to me. He then turned to Carol, his patience visibly gone. "Ma'am," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "this is a civil matter. According to your own rules, which you signed for right here, he's allowed to build this. My partner and I have actual police work to do. Please stop calling 911 for bylaw disputes. Have a nice day." He and Officer Davis turned and walked back to their cruisers. The public humiliation was total. Carol stood frozen on my lawn, her mouth agape, the papers hanging limply from her hand. As the police cars pulled away, a sound broke the silence. It was Hank, clapping, slowly at first, then enthusiastically. A few other neighbors who had been watching joined in. It wasn't a roar, but it was a clear, unmistakable ripple of applause. Defeated, shamed, and utterly stripped of her power, Carol wilted. She didn't say another word. She just turned, shuffled back to her golf cart with the posture of a deflated balloon, and drove away. The reign of terror was over. The incident with the police was the tipping point. It was one thing for Carol to be a neighborhood nuisance, leaving passive-aggressive notes and measuring grass. It was another thing entirely to waste city resources and publicly humiliate herself, and, by extension, the entire HOA. The story of her showdown on my lawn spread through Maple Creek like wildfire. For years, residents had grumbled about her in private, but her public defeat had emboldened them. The dam of silent resentment was about to break. That evening, I got a call from Hank. "Leo, my boy, you've done it," he boomed into the phone. "You've woken the sleeping giant. A few of us have been talking. Brenda, the Gables, even that fella from down the street whose satellite dish she tried to get taken down. We're calling for an emergency HOA meeting. Time for a little coup d'etat." The meeting was scheduled for that Thursday in the community clubhouse, a sterile beige room that perfectly matched the rest of the neighborhood. The air inside was thick with tension. The room was more packed than I had ever seen it. It was divided into unspoken factions. On one side sat Carol and her handful of loyalist cronies, looking stern and self-righteous. On the other side sat, well, everyone else. They were the silent majority who were finally ready to be heard. I took a seat in the back, planning to just be an observer. I had fought my war. This was their revolution. Carol, attempting to project an aura of calm control, stood at the podium and called the meeting to order. "As you know," she began, her voice strained, "an emergency meeting was called by several residents. While this is highly irregular, I have allowed it. Now, what seems to be the—" Hank cut her off. He stood up, his large frame commanding the room's attention. "We know why we're here, Carol," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We're here to talk about you." What followed was an airing of grievances that was years in the making. One by one, residents stood up and shared their stories. A woman recounted how Carol had fined her because her son's chalk drawings on the sidewalk were considered unauthorized graffiti. A man spoke about the 3-month battle he'd had to endure to get a screen door approved. Brenda, her voice shaking but resolute, talked about the fear-mongering over my plants. It was a flood of frustration, a chorus of people who were tired of living in a community ruled by fear and petty tyranny. Carol tried to defend herself, citing the bylaws and her duty to uphold them, but her arguments sounded hollow and pathetic. Her power had always been derived from the illusion of absolute authority, and now, with the whole neighborhood challenging her, that illusion was shattering. Then Hank looked to the back of the room. "Leo," he called out, "I think everyone here would like to hear from you." Every head turned in my direction. My heart pounded. I hadn't prepared a speech. But as I walked to the front of the room, the words just came. I didn't yell or accuse, I just told my story. "Hi, everyone," I started, leaning into the microphone. "My name is Leo, and I live at 112 Orchard Lane. Most of you probably know me as the Flytrap guy." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the room. I calmly and humorously laid out the entire saga, starting with the very first letter. It said I owned non-cultivated ceramic vessels, I said, holding up a copy of the original notice. which I think is the fanciest way anyone has ever said empty pots. More laughter, louder this time. I read aloud some of the most ridiculous violation notices: the 4.25-inch blade of grass, the elliptical garden hose, the seasonal shadow intrusion. With each one, the laughter in the room grew, and Carol shrank a little more behind the podium. "I have to admit," I continued, "at first I was just having a bit of fun, but it stopped being fun when my contractor was being screamed at in my backyard, and it really stopped being fun when I had 2 police officers on my lawn because of a pergola." I paused, letting that sink in. I looked around the room, making eye contact with my neighbors. "A neighborhood should be about community, not about control," I said, my voice ringing with a conviction I didn't know I had. "It should be about looking out for each other, not measuring each other's grass with a ruler." "These bylaws," I said, gesturing to the thick binder on Carol's podium, "were meant to protect our property values and ensure a safe, clean environment. They were never meant to be used as a weapon in one person's petty kingdom." I thanked them and sat down. The room was silent for a moment, and then it erupted in applause. It was loud, sustained, and cathartic. When it died down, Hank stood up again. "I think it's clear things need to change," he said. "I'd like to make a motion for a vote of no confidence in Carol Jenkins as president of the HOA." Someone seconded the motion immediately. Ballots were quickly passed out. The result was a landslide. Out of nearly 60 households present, 54 voted to remove her. In a final pathetic grasp for power, Carol slammed the gavel. "This vote is out of order. This entire meeting is illegitimate." But no one was listening anymore. Her reign was over. Before the meeting adjourned, another motion was made to nominate Hank as the interim president. He looked reluctant, but after some encouragement from the crowd, he accepted. All right, he said, holding up his hands. "I'll do it. On one condition. My first act as president will be to form a committee to review, simplify, and tear out about 200 pages of nonsense from these bylaws." The crowd roared its approval. A new day had dawned in Maple Creek Estates. A month has passed since the great HOA coup. Autumn is in full swing now, and the oppressive, sterile silence of Maple Creek Estates has been replaced by something that feels a lot more like life. Kids' chalk drawings, bold, colorful, and wildly imaginative, now adorn the sidewalks without fear of repercussion. People linger in their driveways, talking to each other. There's a palpable sense of lightness in the air, the feeling of a collective breath being released after being held for too long. I'm sitting in my backyard, under my brand new, beautifully finished cedar pergola. Dave and his crew did an incredible job. The scent of the fresh wood hangs in the cool evening air. A string of warm cafe lights I installed last weekend casts a soft golden glow over the patio. It's my sanctuary, a monument to a war I never wanted to fight, but am damn glad I won. Hank is here with me, leaning back in one of my new patio chairs with a bottle of beer in his hand. We're watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. "You know," he says, taking a long sip, "this president thing is a lot of paperwork, but we're making progress. We've already officially struck the elliptical hose clause from the record." He chuckles. "We're thinking of having it framed." We talk for a while about the changes. Carol is still here, but she's become a ghost in her own neighborhood. The Justice Mobile stays parked in her garage. She doesn't attend the HOA meetings. When you see her getting her mail, she keeps her head down and doesn't make eye contact. I don't feel triumph when I see her, just a strange sort of pity. Her tiny empire had been her whole world, and now it's gone. Later, after Hank goes home, I walk out to my front porch. My army of Venus flytraps is thriving in the cool air. They've become a permanent, beloved fixture. They are no longer a symbol of defiance, but a landmark. A testament to the fact that sometimes the most absurd problems require the most absurd solutions. The neighborhood kids still stop by to look at them, and I've taken to teaching them how the traps work. I even saw one of Carol's former loyalists, a stern-faced woman named Margaret, pausing by my porch the other day. I saw her crack a tiny, secretive smile before she walked on. I stand there for a moment, reflecting on the whole ridiculous ordeal. I bought this house wanting peace and quiet, a place to call my own. Instead, I got a lesson in petty tyranny, contract law, and the surprising resilience of a community. I never set out to be a revolutionary. I just wanted to be left alone with my empty flower pots. But in the end, I'm glad for how it all turned out. This place feels more like a home now, more like a real neighborhood. As I'm about to head inside, a fat, noisy bluebottle fly begins buzzing insistently around my head. It's slow and clumsy. With a quick, practiced motion, I snatch it out of the air, its frantic buzzing vibrating in my closed fist, walk over to the largest, healthiest plant on the porch, the one that started it all. "Dinner time, Carol Jr.," I say with a grin, and I open my hand, dropping the fly onto one of its waiting traps. Thwip! The trap snaps shut. The pot is no longer empty. It's full of a strange, satisfying, and very active kind of victory.